So here we're going to talk about some of the key concepts in Hinduism here. And I'll put myself down in the corner here so we can see the key concepts in Hinduism. First of all, Hindus believe in an ultimate God, a God beyond all comprehension, beyond the universe, beyond space and time, beyond human comprehension. This God is so far above personhood or existence that we cannot even think about who or what this God is. In Hinduism, all of the many gods that exist are all manifestations of this ultimate God called Brahman. Why do we need so many personal gods? Because that's all we can conceive of, our personal beings. We can't conceive of God as he is, and or she is, or it is, or again, we just don't have a proper pronoun. So one of the things about Hinduism is, if I worship Vishnu and you worship Shiva and she worships Durga and he worships Kali, it doesn't much matter. They're all manifestations of Brahman, and they can all help us towards our ultimate goal, which is moksha. And we'll talk about that in a second. So in Hinduism, you do have an eternal soul called Atman. Now, if you remember, the Buddha didn't like this idea at all, and he believed in Anatman, which means no soul, or anatta. And but in Hinduism, each person has a soul, if you will, but it's not as individual as you think it is. It really is Brahman in each person. We all, in some sense, share the same universal soul because everything's a manifestation of Brahman. Okay? Now, we don't see this. Why don't we see this? Because we're only capable of perceiving things in a limited dualistic way. We see contrast, we see differences between different concepts that we identify, but we do not have the senses to perceive the unity of everything. There's no way I can look at you and see and perceive that we share the same universal soul. I may in some way acquiesce to that teaching, but what I'm really allowing for is that there is a reality beyond that which I can conceive of, and I recognize the limits of my conception, but I'm okay in saying beyond the limits of my conception, I believe there's something that exists that's beyond my ability to perceive it. So, Maya is the illusion of the world, and if you believe this world is the only world and you get too attached to it, obviously that's a very, very bad thing. You have to live in this world as if it's the real world and respond to it in the most ethical way, but the whole time you're reminding yourself that this isn't the real world, that what I'm perceiving here is really an illusion, and the reason it's illusory is because of the limitations of my own conception, of the limitations of my own perception. Now, this is very much the same kind of thing as Christianity or many, many other kinds of religions that's telling you that the ultimate reality is beyond your conception. And even though you're living in this world that you see and is very real to you, you have to at the same time believe that there is a higher reality, a more real reality, to be redundant. And believing this, it helps you from not getting too attached to the way this world is. So we're familiar with this concept. Now, here are the four that are important: karma, dharma, samsara, and moksha. First of all, samsara really has nothing to do with us per se. Samsara is the cycle in all of the universe. It's like a natural law. You don't need to try to attain it or discover it, or it's just the way things are. Samsara is the wheel of rebirth. The way samsara affects human beings is that when they die, their Atman, their soul, transmigrates and is reborn in another physical form, is reincarnated in another form. We call this the transmigration of the soul. This is not something that you control or that you have to even want or seek. Rebirth or reincarnation from samsara is like the sun rising in the morning. It's going to happen whether you want it to or not. And there's nothing you need to do to help it. Nor would you rejoice because it happened. It's a given. It's like, oh my God, I prayed and prayed and prayed that the sun will rise, and it rose. That would be very silly, right? That's the way samsara is. It's the cycle in all the universe. It's, not affected by you in any way, shape, or form, but it's accepted as a reality. The way samsara affects you, though, is very important. Samsara causes you to be reborn over and over and over again for thousands of times in classical Hinduism. Now, one brief explanation here. We live in the 21st century, and in the 20th and 21st century, it's really becoming okay for anybody to think anything they want to about anything. And so you're going to find all kinds of different views in Hinduism today, just like you're going to find all kinds of different views in Christianity or Judaism or any of the other religions on earth, because most places on earth, it's becoming more and more okay to have your own ideas about things. And we, of course, live in one of the premier places on earth for that kind of a liberty. Here you can believe whatever you want, and there's no law that says that if you don't believe the right way, you're going to be punished for it. We live in a multicultural, pluralistic society where your right to believe whatever you want is guaranteed. So we're talking here about classical Hinduism, but some of the more evolved Hindus, or some of the ones that are more familiar with international culture and religions and so on, may have some more evolved views about this. But in the traditional sense, everybody is reincarnated over and over and over and over again, thousands of times. Reincarnation is not really a blessing. It's more of a curse. And this is something most monotheists haven't ever thought about. Why is it a curse? Well, think of it this way. What do all of the world religions have in common? One of the things is that when they think of the ultimate reality, or when they think of the reality they hope to experience when they die, it is always the absence of everything that causes suffering. There's no more sickness, there's no more dying, no more death, there's no more famine, there's no more warfare, there's no more competition. Are you with me? So anything that causes suffering is not present in the final reality. But in this world, it's always present. Suffering is present. Injustice is present. Okay? Who wants to come back to this unjust world over and over and over and over again? If we wanted that, we would have never begun to think about the possibility of a reality where suffering and injustice didn't exist. That's what we want to experience. Okay? So coming back to this world full of sorrow and heartbreak and injustice, where your dreams all get crushed, and finally you get older and weaker and sicker until finally you die, and all kinds of suffering because you're losing the only thing that you know that's meant anything, and that's you and your life. Who wants to come back to this and do it all over again? From screaming in childbirth to the tragedy of dying and giving it all up again, and every letdown, every disillusionment, every experience of suffering in between. So coming back to this life over and over again is not really a blessing, it's a curse. The only thing that you might, from a monotheistic point of view, be able to see as a blessing is the fact that you get more than one lifetime to get it right. Because, of course, in classical monotheism, you just have one lifetime. There's no reincarnation back to this world again. So we want to escape the wheel of rebirth. We don't want to be reborn. We don't want to come back to this world again. What we want to do is we want to break out of the cycle of rebirth, and we want to attain the ultimate goal in all of Hinduism, which is called moksha. Moksha is deliverance, freedom, liberation from this terrible problem of samsara. You can almost think of it as like the gravitational pull of the earth or something. When you try to launch a rocket, it goes up a ways, but not too far, because gravity's going to pull it right back down again. And that's kind of the way samsara works in a hypothetical point of view. And what you finally want to do is you want to be in the proper position with an adequate amount of good karmic force to break out of this gravitational pull, if you will, and escape this atmosphere, escape being pulled back down to this reality again, free of this flawed reality forever. And we call this moksha. You're going to be one with God forever in a world where there is no more suffering. And by the way, this is the same kind of thing that monotheists in Islam and Christianity hope for. Whatever differences of conception in terms of when it happens, how it happens, we're all hoping for the same thing, to experience this reality with God forever, apart from this world of suffering. So how do we experience this? Now we're going to talk about karma and dharma. Now, dharma is your social responsibility. It is fallacious to think of secular responsibilities and spiritual responsibilities. Today we think of them that way, and that's okay. We've made a distinction between what a spiritual responsibility is and a secular responsibility. But you got to understand, going back to classical Hinduism, or this time, in virtually any civilization on earth, people aren't making this same kind of distinction. between what is sacred and what is secular, between a sacred responsibility and a secular responsibility. Your sacred views inform every area of your life. When people are fulfilling their social duties, they're fulfilling their social duties because they believe those are the social duties that God gave them to fulfill. So if they don't fulfill their social duties, they're not fulfilling their religious duties either. So there's no real distinction between them. So get that whole secular sacred dichotomy out of your head here. It doesn't work for this. So you want to fulfill your social duty. Now, what determines your social duty? Well, when you're born, where you're born, what caste you're born into, what social class you're born into. And Hinduism is divided into different social classes or castes, as we call them. And they range from, on the very, very top, the priestly caste, to then the aristocratic, the leadership caste. These are the military officers, the governors, the kings, whatever, nobility. To then the merchant class, anybody that owns any kind of business that produces a profit, whether you own land or whether you own some kind of a business that makes things that people need to survive, anything where you own a business and make money. The fourth caste, as we're going down, would be the laborers, those who perform some kind of a function, anywhere from unskilled all the way up to skilled labor, but you don't own the business, you're working for wages. And even below this, there's a group of people that we call outcasts, because they're out of the caste system, that perform certain functions that are so ignoble as to be thought, according to ancient reasoning, that they somehow make you ritually unclean, and so other people cannot have contact with you. And anything that involves dealing with dead bodies, contact with disease, contact with blood, many other things defile you ritually. And I don't have a lot of time to talk about that, but what I want to get across here is that as we're being reincarnated over and over and over again, assuming that we're good people and we are producing mostly good karma, we'll talk about that in a second, we are going to be reincarnated in successively higher and higher castes and subcastes, moving up through the social order until finally we arrive at the highest caste, which is the priestly caste. And having arrived at this caste, if we lead a very, very ethical, noble life, we might have sufficient karmic force to finally break out of this cycle of samsara and not have to be reincarnated ever again, but finally attain moksha and be one with God forever. And that's what every Hindu is thinking about, according to this classical system, as they perform their social duty. And that is that if they perform their dharma, their social duty well, that they will have the opportunity to be reborn into a higher social class or a higher caste. And eventually, moving up and up and up and up till they get to the highest caste, then they have the opportunity to attain moksha if they lead a very ethical life. Now again, 21st century, there's all kinds of different takes on this, but this is the classical system. So how is it that I move up? Well, first of all, I have to fulfill my dharma well. Whatever my dharma is, whatever vocational clan I'm born into in this particular life, in this particular reincarnation, I know what my social responsibility is based on where I'm born. I'm born in a particular clan, a particular subcaste, if you will, that performs a certain vocation. So that vocation is what I have to fulfill ethically. There's a right way and a wrong way to be the owner of a business. There's a right way or a wrong way to be a teacher, to be a leader, to be a warrior, to be a shepherd, whatever. And so you're going to fulfill your social responsibility in an ethical way. You're going to fulfill it the best way you can. All of the time, living ethically, trying to love your neighbor as yourself, not causing harm to people, not in any way promoting or any kind of injustice. And these are all concepts that we understand pretty well. Although we don't focus so much as your social duty vocationally being a duty to God in our society today, since we separate sacred and secular, as I mentioned before. So if I perform my dharma well, with integrity, ethically, loving my neighbor as myself, being the best kind of person I can be in the vocation I'm called to be, I am going to produce and accrue good karma. Now let me stop for a second here. I want to point out to you different verbs that I'm using. When I talked about dharma, the verb I kept using is fulfilling my dharma. My Dharma was given to me when I was born, based on where I was born in society. I didn't have a choice of picking that. Again, not talking about 21st century, talking about the classical system. Okay, I have to fulfill my Dharma. But when we talk about karma, by fulfilling my Dharma, I am both producing and accruing good karma. Producing means my actions are producing karma. If they're actions that are ethical, I'm producing good karma. If I am somehow willing to cause harm to others to produce some kind of good benefit to myself, that would be producing bad karma, obviously. And again, these are basic ethical ideas that we're all kind of familiar with. So, by producing good karma, I'm also accruing good karma. Accruing, it means I'm storing it up. And all of this karma that I'm storing up, it's almost kind of like cause and effect in the sense that every action has an appropriate reaction. And that reaction you can think of as, sometimes people talk about karma in terms of waves, karmic waves. But this karma that you're producing, it kind of has your name on it. So when you finally die, all of the karma that you have produced, all of the karma that you have accrued, that you have stored up, is what facilitates your rebirth. So if you have predominantly good karma, it's going to facilitate a rebirth into a higher social station, getting closer to that point where you can break out of the cycle of reincarnation. But if you have predominantly bad karma, it's going to be moving you down. And by the way, if you have really bad karma, you were some kind of a serial killer, a sociopath, or whatever, you may have to suffer in some kind of hell for 2,000 years before you get the chance to be reborn as a slug again and start over. There's all kinds of different answers to these strange exceptions to the rule. And in Hinduism, there's many different ways of looking at it. You're not required in being a Hindu to adhere to one particular answer to all of these different kinds of questions. There's many different kinds of answers to these questions. In that case, it's very dissimilar to very rigid Christianity or Islam, for instance. Anyway, so let's say that I have produced mostly good karma. How does that affect me? Well, it affects me in three different ways. We already know the idea of what goes around comes around. That would be talking about the first way that karma would affect you in the same life you're living in. If I do a bunch of bad things and a bunch of bad things happen to me in this life that I deserve based on what I did in this life, that's the what goes around comes around. That's me getting rewarded in this lifetime. But of course, we know that there's not justice in this world on any great scale. So clearly karma works in other ways. The number two way that karma works, and this is going to be the way that most of your karma is going to be expended or exhausted, and that is facilitating your rebirth. So obviously you want to have mostly good karma so that in your rebirth you will move up. But here's the third way, and this is where it gets interesting. If you have a lot of good karma, or you have a great deal of bad karma, all of that karma may not be exhausted in facilitating your rebirth. Therefore, some of that karma that's left over may follow you into your next life, where it continues to affect you. If you need to back it up and listen to that again, do it. Let me give you an example. Let's say you have a next door neighbor. She's a wonderful lady. She's ethical. She loves people. She gives money to the poor. She goes in and serves food at a local soup kitchen. She would never knowingly hurt anyone. She just wants to be a blessing. And yet, bad stuff is always happening to her. She's like the kid in the cartoon where all of the other kids are out playing in the sunshine, but this one kid has a rain cloud that just follows him over his head, raining on him everywhere he goes. We've all known people like that. Great people, but they just can't get a break. And we think, that's just so unfair. She doesn't deserve that. Now, this would be the explanation. The explanation would be that she, in her last life, must have produced a great deal of bad karma. And while most of that karma was probably exhausted or expended in facilitating her rebirth, there was so much of it that some of that bad karma followed her into her present life, and it still continues to affect her, which is why bad things still keep happening to her. She doesn't deserve that based on what she's done in this present lifetime, but because of what she did in the former lifetime, she produced so much bad karma that it has not yet all been exhausted, and it continues to affect her. Now, there may come a time in this life where finally all that bad karma is exhausted, and she may finally begin to experience the effects of the good karma that she has been producing in this life. But maybe even if the bad karma from the previous life is not expended at all in this life until she gets to the end of her life, still, the next life, all of the good karma that she has produced in this life is going to bless her. It's going to move her up in status. Good karma is going to follow her into her next life. My point is, the good things she's doing now are not in vain, even though she's not experiencing the benefits of them right now. Are you with me so far? Now, this can work the other way around. Imagine that there's somebody who kind of has the Midas touch, if you're familiar with that. Everything they touch turns to gold. Everything they try to do, they're marvelously successful. It's almost like there's some spiritual force, some divine favor on them, some magic that makes everything that they do turn out well. And yet they're horrible people. They've been successful by stepping on other people, by dealing unethically, by caring about no one but themselves. And we are offended by the fact that someone this wicked seems to have escaped karma altogether and seems to be blessed in every unethical thing they do. Well, there's an explanation for this. It's very similar to what we just talked about, only it's the inverse. This person in their last life must have produced so much good karma that once most of that karma was expended in facilitating their rebirth, there was still so much left that a bunch of that good karma followed them into the present life, and it continues to affect them. So even though this person is producing tons of bad karma, and at one point it will catch up with him, he's not getting away with anything, he still has some good karma left that is favoring him now. But oh my God, when that karma runs out, look out, because then all that bad karma is going to begin to affect him. And maybe it'll be in this life, maybe it'll be in the next one, but still, he's not getting away with anything. Once that good karma from the last life is expended, that bad karma is going to kick his butt. Make sense? Now, let's see if you're really getting this. You think that you've got the whole idea of how it works? Let me ask you a question, and you can find out if you understand it or not, okay? That girl we talked about that lives next door to you, the really good person with all the bad things happening to her, was she in a higher or a lower social caste in her last life? Again, the question, was she in a higher caste or a lower caste in her past life? Think about it. Now, when I ask this in class, I say, how many people, think she was in, a lower caste? And a bunch of people will raise their hands. But that's flawed thinking. She was actually in a higher caste. Now, let's think about this. She has what kind of karma working in her life? Bad karma. This is karma that's left over that wasn't exhausted in facilitating her rebirth, right? So the karma that facilitated her rebirth that was exhausted was also bad karma. What does bad karma do? It moves you down, which means that she would have been at a higher caste in her last life. And all the bad karma that she accrued moved her down. But she had so much bad karma that it wasn't all exhausted in moving her down. Make sense? And the guy that's very successful with the Midas touch, he was in a lower caste in his past life and apparently lived a very exemplary life. I mean, he stored up so much good karma that his reward is, in this life, he ends up being a person of some power and influence. Unfortunately, he's not living ethically. He's using that power and influence to hurt other people and serve himself. And so now he's accruing tons of bad karma. And even though it's not affecting him yet, it's going to. So in his past life, he was actually in a lower caste, was moved up, but oh my God, after this life, he's taken a plunge. Are you with me? Now, let me say one other thing that's very similar to the way we would think about things. It's much easier to fall than it is to rise. To rise, you rise by patient continuance in well-doing, lifetime after lifetime after lifetime. And Hindus take this very seriously if they believe this concept, which most of them still do on some level, even though they may have modified some of these ideas about how many lifetimes you have to live and so on. So how long does it take to build a good reputation? A lifetime. How long does it take to lose it? I don't know, 15 seconds on YouTube? Are you with me? How long does it take to climb a mountain? A high mountain? Well, Maybe it takes a couple weeks. How long does it take to get to the bottom? If you don't care whether you live or die, just jump. You'll be down there in no time at all. It works the same kind of way as gravity. It's easier to fall than it is to rise. So it's very important that every life you're trying very, very hard to build up good karma, and you realize you're making stair steps. But you do not want to blow it in this life and drop numerous levels and have to live another 1,000 lives to make up for it. And that's the way people think. So we're talking about this, patient continuance and well-doing. After many, what we call fortunate rebirths, that means you're reborn in a better state, when you finally get to the top caste, the top social class, which are the priests, in this caste, if you live a very virtuous life and devote yourself to experiencing this unity with God in this life, and you accrue a lot of good karma, you might finally have sufficient karmic force to break out of samsara, to break out of the cycle of rebirth and attain that liberation and attain the goal that you've longed for your entire life, all of your lives, which is moksha, to be with God forever. And that's the ultimate dharma of every Hindu, is to get your soul free, to attain moksha. Hopefully this has explained some of this a little bit better, and we'll go back to talking now about why this particular concept of theodicy is very, very notable in its intelligibility. On 246, the top paragraph, it talks about a completely intelligible explanation. And it is. You can understand this. You don't have to appeal to the fact that, yes, I know this makes no sense, but you got to believe that it's true. It's another reality you can't conceive of. You don't have to say anything about this. This makes perfect sense. Now, some student at this point in every class is going to go, yeah, but how do they know this is all true? To which I will say, you've forgotten how to bracket. How do you know, let's assume you're religious, how do you know you have a soul? How do you know that heaven is real? How do you know that God even exists? Prove it to me scientifically. And of course you can't. All faith is based on subjective experience. Some experience that, in some way adds meaning and purpose to your life. And maybe everybody can see what a wonderful countenance you have, but you can't prove to them that you had that experience. And they can't prove to you that you didn't. The person with an experience is never at the mercy of the person with an argument. So for a Hindu to believe this is the same thing as you, if you happen to be a Christian or a Muslim, in believing that God exists and there's going to be a final judgment and you're going to go to heaven, and none of this can be confirmed either. Why do you believe it? Well, there's two reasons, obviously. Number one, it's what you've been taught. But the reason that you believe it, the big reason, is because somehow it works for you. Somehow it makes it easier to navigate this life with all of its injustice and all of its suffering. Somehow it brings meaning and purpose into your life, makes you a better person, makes your experience of life better, gives you a higher quality of living. That's why you believe it. So my point is, this explains it. It works. And so this is one thing I want you to get now. Of all of the systems of theodicy, this one more says that what you are experiencing is what you do deserve. Now, you may not deserve it based on your actions in this life. But if you don't, you do deserve it based on your actions in the previous life. Alrighty, we're going to move on to the monotheism section now. And I'm not going to go through the book as laboriously here. Most of you will understand some of these already. Suffering is a recompense for sin. If you go back and you read some of the ancient scriptures, it seems like you're going to get this message more than anything else, that God is going to punish sin and he's going to reward righteousness. Of course, the big problem is that it just doesn't seem like that happens a lot of the time. So when it doesn't happen, you have to ask yourself, what is different about this situation? Why is this an exception to the rule where things aren't, being just? And of course, this is a big problem. But the idea of suffering being a recompense for sin, that somehow you're being punished by God, that's a very, very common one. And even if you realize that there are many situations where that really couldn't be the case, still, if you're a religious person, even to this day, and something bad happens to you and you believe that there's a God that can intervene in your life, one of the first things you might ask yourself is, did I do something wrong? Do I deserve this? Is this you, God? And we may decide that that's not the case, but even today, that's still something that very much people think about. However, as we said, we are constantly reminded that what happens to people in this life is not fair. Bad things happen to good people, good things happen to bad people. So the whole idea of suffering as being a recompense for sin often is a big, big problem. Now, we're going to talk more about this in a minute. I'm just going to give you 3 of them real quick, and then we're going to kind of talk about all of them in a sense. Number 2 is suffering as a test and a necessary condition of soul making on page 248. In other words, suffering somehow is making you the person that you're supposed to be. You can't get where you're supposed to be without going through this unjust tragedy or whatever it is. And so a lot of times when bad things happen, and people maybe don't think necessarily they deserve them, if they believe in a God, say, and this is monotheism, so we're talking about this, if they believe in a God that's somehow involved in their life and sovereign over their life, they would have to come to the conclusion that, okay, if it's not because I deserve this, then God's will that I go through this because he's going to do something in my life through it. He's going to teach me something. He's going to make me a better person. I'm going to come out of it more powerful, more resilient. I'm going to come out of it with more compassion for other people. And so we might ask ourselves why God would be letting this unjust thing happen. And that's what it's talking about here when it says a condition of soul making. Somehow this unjust tragedy is God's will to benefit us in some way. And then the last thing here in this section is a theodicy of submission. And this is related to the mystery of God's sovereignty. Now, this comes down to proper faith. Let's say you're in a situation and there's no way in the world that you can understand that this would be something that you deserve. But when you look at the situation and you go, gee, could God be using it to do something, something good in my life? That just doesn't seem to hold water either. I mean, there's just some way that I'm sorry, this is too much. This is, if you're producing some good work in my life, this is not the way that a just and righteous God and a loving God would have done it. And maybe that doesn't work for you either. So maybe you just don't understand at all. But in monotheism, there's the idea that even when you don't understand, you are still supposed to have faith in God's righteousness and God's sovereignty, even though you don't understand it. And you submit yourself, therefore, to the mystery of God's will, because it's beyond you to understand why this is happening. So I have no idea. All I know is, as wrong as this seems, as confusing as it is, I'm making a decision to trust God anyway. Now, those are the 3 big ones in monotheism. And if you're a monotheist and you believe that God is working in your life, these are probably the 3 that you're very familiar with. Now, instead of going through the book, I want to tell you a story about a guy named Job. And there's, if you're familiar with this, in the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, what Christians call the Old Testament, there's a book called Job. And very briefly here, Job is a very righteous man. In fact, in the area where he lives, he is held in esteem by everybody. He's one of the elders of the people, considered a very righteous man. And this particular book, this particular writing, comes to its final form in the Axial Age period. And there's an addendum to it at the beginning. It originally is a story about an unjust situation, but now with the Axial Age, we have this new belief in this character named Satan or Lucifer. In Zoroastrianism, they call him Ahriman or Angramanyu, and he's being blamed for all kinds of evil things that happen. Now, you might think this really changes things, but it really doesn't. Because if God's stronger than Satan, and Satan can only do what God lets him do, then if Satan is causing you suffering, God let Satan cause you suffering. So even if God's not doing it, in some sense, he willed for it to happen because he didn't prevent it. So it doesn't really change things all that much, but it does add a very different dynamic to your questioning of why things are happening. Is is the force of evil involved? Is Satan involved? Is a demon involved? Is there somebody that hates me that's doing this to me, and for some reason God has let it happen? So it adds another dimension to things. So at the very beginning of this story, once we believe in Satan, there's a kind of a prelude where God is, and I'll be a little bit sarcastic with this to make it funny, but God seems to be having some kind of a get-together, and he calls all of these sons of God to come before him, whatever that means. And Satan comes because he's one of the sons of God, apparently. And so when Satan comes before God, apparently they have some kind of a banter already going on. God tells Satan, hey, have you checked out my servant Job? How righteous he is? And Satan basically says, hey, the only reason Job is righteous is because you give him everything that he wants. But if you took everything away, he'd curse you to your face. And basically God says, okay, I'll take that bet. Shake on it. Now, let's just stop right here. Today, no theologian believes that God is, so concerned with how Satan thinks of him, or anybody thinks of him, that he's making bets with other beings to try and prove that he's more right than they are. Obviously, our theology of God is much higher than that. So you can already see that this is just an early reasoning about this, and God and Satan are almost seen as equals here, bantering with each other. And they're not equals, but at least there's more of a semblance of it, that God is actually going out of his way to try and convince Satan that, hey, look how I rock. Anyway, so God takes Satan's bet, and Satan is allowed to take away everything that means anything to Job, and Job supposedly is going to curse God to his face when Satan does that. So Satan kills all of his children. He's got 10 children. Satan kills them all. Satan ends up giving him, just horrible outcomes. But he won't curse God. He just won't do it. He'll curse himself. He'll curse the day he's born. He will not curse God. And so it seems like God's won the bet. So God has some other kind of get-together, garden party, I don't know what it is. And once again, all the sons of God come before God. It's another get-together. And now this banter goes on where Satan comes up and God says, hey, pay up, I win. I let you take away everything that was meaningful to Job, and he still hasn't cursed me to my face. You were wrong. And Satan says, yeah, but flesh for flesh. Said a man will give everything for his flesh. You let me afflict him, he'll curse you to your face. So God says, but you can't kill him. You can't kill him. Satan says, okay, agreed. So go ahead and make another bet. It's a bet. So now, again, you don't like this God very much, do you? I don't either. But anyway, it's an ancient concept. So Satan goes out this time and makes Job horribly, horribly ill. Gives him some kind of leprosy or something where he's got open, festering, pustulous sores all over his body. It says he sits out on the street and he's scraping his sores with broken pottery. It says even the dogs come and lick his sores. I mean, this is a horrible picture. And but he still won't curse God. By the way, his wife has just had enough of this, and his wife is just like, oh, come on. Curse God and die. I mean, it's not going to get any better. It's like, give up, curse God and die. Let your life be over. And he won't do it. He still will not curse God. Now, here's where the story gets interesting, because the prelude is over. All of this is just the prelude. Here's the real story. Job has 3 friends who are also elders of the people. And by the way, I'm going to give you a very quick, condensed version of the story to try and get a point across here, because I don't have time to go through all of this. It's very interesting. But let's talk about his 3 friends, also elders of the people, who have heard that Job is suffering, and they go to comfort their friend. That is their desire. They're going to go comfort him. But they don't end up being comforters. In fact, we nickname them the 3 miserable comforters, because instead of bringing comfort, they bring misery. And let me tell you how it happens. When these 3 friends, who are also ethical people, elders, get to Job, they expect that Job is going to tell them why this is happening. Job's going to say, oh my God, I knew I shouldn't have slept with my neighbor's wife, or I knew I shouldn't have lied against this guy in court, or I knew I shouldn't have stolen this, or they're expecting Job to give them some idea why it's happening, after which they will comfort him and probably tell him that God's going to be merciful, just, repent with all your heart. But the problem is, when they get to Job, Job doesn't say anything like that. What Job says in a nutshell is, I didn't do anything to deserve this. And this really offends his friends. Because by Job saying, I didn't do anything to deserve this, what it sounds like Job is saying is God is not just. And these three elders have spent their lives teaching people that God is just, teaching people that, as we said, you suffer because of your sin. It's God's judgment. And they've taught that their whole life. So if God willed for this to happen, but Job didn't deserve it, that makes God unrighteous, and they can't have that. So the three of them go into long diatribe. In fact, there's, I think, 10 full chapters in the book of Job that constitute these three miserable comforters' arguments to Job. They're theological arguments. And their theological arguments are, basically geared to, one, prove that Job really is a sinner, even though he won't admit it, which obviously is even a deeper sin. But number two, and this is the important one, they're defending God's justice. They're defending God's righteousness. Since Job seems to be challenging the fact that God is just, they feel like they need to defend God. And so they go through 10 chapters, and if you want to condense them into one statement with 2 clauses, this is it. Their whole point is God is far too righteous to have let all this stuff happen to you if you did not deserve it. I'm going to say it one more time. This is the conclusion of their arguments. God is far too righteous to let all of this stuff happen to you if you didn't deserve it. So what's the point in going out of your way to talk about how righteous you are and how you don't deserve it? And, what are you saying, that God is unrighteous? Now, Job has been doing a pretty good job of keeping his patience, not cursing God, not, being uppity or whatever. But his three miserable comforters get Job all worked up. And by the time, Job is worked up, he's at the point now where it's like, if this is true, it's like where I've done something and I deserve this, then God, tell me what it is. And again, I'm skipping part of the story, but let's get to the end here. So he starts challenging God. Well, as he's challenging God to show him why this is happening, God answers him. In fact, God answers him out of a tornado. So if you've been yelling at God because something's unjust and you see a funnel cloud coming your way that's grounding out, it might be God's answer to you, because God answers Job out of the whirlwind, out of the tornado. And for 2 full chapters, if I remember right, God is basically asking Job questions like, excuse me, where were you when I created the earth? Tell me how I did it. How did I separate the water from the land? How did I make the stars stay up in the sky there? And tell me how I did this. And he asks Job all of these questions that, of course, Job cannot answer. And Job is completely humbled. I mean, he's brought down to the point of like, how dare I even question God like this? And most people think this is the end of the story, but it's not. At the end of this particular conversation, Job repents before God and says, hey, look, he goes, I've spoken about things that are way, way, way beyond me, that I couldn't, God's basically told him, look, if I answered your question, you could not even understand the answer. You don't have this capability. And Job accepts that and says, look, hey, I thought I understood you before, but it's only like I heard of you. Now I see much more clearly, and I'm sorry. I repent, in dust and ashes. I mean, I won't speak in this challenging way again, apparently. But the story's not over. God goes back to those 3 miserable comforters, and somehow God speaks to them, and this is what God says to them. He says, I'm angry with you because you didn't tell the truth about me like my servant Job did. Whoa, 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 whoa. Stop. Wait a minute. What did they say? They said that God was too righteous to let something unjust like this happen. And God's saying, no, wrong. Job was right when he said that he didn't deserve this, which is what Job said. Job said, this isn't just. And his 3 miserable comforters said, it has to be just. And God came back and said, no, not true. It doesn't have to be just. Job was right. It's not just. And he tells those 3 friends to go to Job and repent. And then God will forgive them. Wow. So Job is kind of vindicated. Now, this is pretty interesting. Okay? Because what God is saying, in effect, is Job was right when he said this wasn't just. Now, so we've gone through a couple things here. I mean, we're now at the point, the mystery of God's sovereignty. We just don't know anything about why God would let this happen. But we do know something. And that is the way that Job's 3 friends responded to this was not right. What did they do? They tried to defend God. They tried to create a theology that justified God. That's a theodicy, right? They're trying to create something that justifies God. Do we do this today? And I'm speaking, of course, as if we're religious people, and yes, all the time. But what God is saying, I don't need you guys to defend me. I don't need a theology created to justify me. It's beyond your understanding why these things happen, or why I let them happen, or why I will them to happen. But one thing is for sure, this isn't just. This wasn't just what happened to Job. And what God's basically saying is, I don't need to be defended by you guys. I don't need you guys to create a theology to defend me. Now, let me give you an example of this. Hope this doesn't offend anyone, but I'm going to put this in a context that maybe will really hit home. Let's imagine there are two evangelical Christians. Why evangelical Christians? Because we're in America. And when we talk about people who are constantly trying to bring their faith into situations, evangelical Christians work really well. I have nothing against them. I might be an evangelical Christian. You don't even know. But I can tell you I have a lot of friends that are. So imagine two evangelical Christians. Say it's two young ladies who are driving down the interstate, and they get off at an exit, and as they're coming up to the end of the exit ramp, they see a guy standing there with a sign, saying, "Veteran hungry, please help," or whatever. And the one girl looks at the other girl and goes, "Man, that's just so sad. That's such a shame. I mean, if he would just give his life to Jesus." Why did I stop? Because that's the end of the story. Let's unpack that. They said, if he would only give his life to Jesus. Let's think about this. This is a very common type of thing that people say. And they sound like they're being charitable because they want him to have a good life. Oh, if he just turned his life to Jesus, then he wouldn't have to suffer like this. So what are they assuming? They're assuming, first of all, that he hasn't given his life to Jesus, that he's somehow wrong with God. And let's just deal with that first. How did they know? I mean, he could have been out in the woods where he was sleeping last night, or on the park bench or whatever, praying and going, God, I've always loved you, and I don't understand why my business failed, and why I lost my house, and why my wife left me, and I don't understand anything, but I still love you, God. I still love you. How do they know he's not right with God? Which brings us to the next thing that they're assuming. When they say that if he would only turn his life over to Jesus, what they're implying is that if he turned his life over to Jesus, his situation would radically change, probably immediately. Now, to unpack that further, that means that they assume that if he was right with God, he would have never ended up in that situation. They've assumed he's not right with God. They've said that if he was right with God, in so many words, that would fix his situation. So what they're really saying is God is far too righteous to have left you on the side of the road, hungry with a sign, if you didn't do something to deserve it. They're doing the exact same thing as Job's miserable comforters did. They don't even know it, but they're creating a theology to defend God, to justify God. They have to believe that God is righteous. And if this man here loved God the right way, and God still allowed him to end up on the street, this challenges their whole understanding of God, and certainly challenges the way that they think that God is going to work in their life to prevent something like this. This is something they don't even want to consider. Are you with me? Now here's the question. What do you do with this if you can't know any of this? The question is, do you need to know? What you need to know is how to respond to the situation. When Job's miserable comforters went to Job, they went with the right idea. They were supposed to comfort him. That's what they should have done. Instead, they found it more important to defend God. And that's what these two evangelical Christians in my hypothetical story are doing. Instead of responding to the guy's predicament, their first inclination is to justify God by saying, if only he'd give his life to Jesus. Somehow, he's got to be responsible for this, right? Now, let's go back to the teachings of Jesus himself, since I'm using evangelical Christians. You see someone hungry. You see someone homeless. Does Jesus say, remember to create a theology that will defend my righteousness when you see these things? Of course not. There's nowhere that Jesus says you're supposed to engage in some kind of theological construction when you see people that are in unfortunate situations. In fact, I won't go through all the dialogue because we don't have time, but there are times when his disciples actually ask him things like that. Why did this tower fall on these guys at Siloam? Were they like more wicked than other guys? And Jesus is like, no, not at all. We're all going to die. You don't know how. My paraphrase. When you see someone who's hungry, what would Jesus tell you to do? Feed him. Don't create a theology to defend God and say, well, God's not unrighteous because this guy's not. He doesn't need you to do that. What he needs you to do is have compassion and ask yourself, why am I in this situation? What can I do to make this situation more just and more righteous? I know it's unjust. Instead of trying to defend God and make sure he's not responsible for the injustice, I should be asking, what can I do? How can I affect this situation? If I see someone, who's hungry or who's homeless or in some kind of terrible situation, I should be doing what I can to make their situation better. If the person is hungry, feed them. Don't create theologies to explain why their own sins somehow caused them to be hungry. And so much of religion today is doing this. And obviously the people that are doing it the most are the ones who are experiencing comfortable life. They feel like, yeah, things are going pretty well, but I love God, and so that's his blessing, and I deserve it. And they're the ones that are most challenged when they see people that apparently love God where things are going very badly for them. And they don't want to believe that that's possible. So what they do is they decide, well, these people must not be doing as well as they claim to. I mean, even if I don't see sin in their life, they must have secret sin somewhere. Or maybe their faith is not right. They're believing in the wrong way, but there's got to be some reason. Because if they were right with God, God would not let them be like that. They'd be like me, being blessed by God, prospering, There's a lot of teaching like that today, isn't there? So again, the end of this story, if you want to get into the Jewish idea, is chutzpah. It's audacity. The divine audacity to question God. Now, this is interesting. Because when you get to Christianity, Christians have kind of abandoned this. It's kind of like you don't question God in any case, or maybe a lightning bolt will come from heaven and fry you, But no, in Judaism, in the case where there is injustice, in the case where someone is hurting who shouldn't be, to go before the throne of God and pitch a holy bitch and say, God, most righteous, look at what is happening here. Why are you doing nothing? Are you sleeping? Are you tired? Did you go on a journey? Are you sitting on the toilet? Are you deaf and you can't hear? Why are you not helping here? Please, do something. And guess what? In Jewish theology, God loves that. It's like, look at little John down there. Oh my God. He's so full of compassion, he will actually come and bust my chops as to why I will not do something. And guess what? According to that theology, that's the way you're supposed to respond. And God actually does respond to those kind of prayers. When you go before God and challenge God with the injustice in the world, God very often responds in that way. But whether he does or whether he doesn't, you should be in that situation where you have compassion. And when you see that situations are just unjust for a particular person, it's okay to go before God and register a complaint. With all of the audacity it may seem like that involves. God likes that. He's not threatened. He's not insecure. He doesn't have small feelings about himself. It's like, how dare you say that about me? How dare you say that I'm unjust? God's not like us. He's perfectly secure in who he is. What he cares about is that in your heart, you're feeling compassion, and it bothers you so much how much somebody is suffering that you will come before God and bitch about it. And God says, A+. Yeah, there's injustice in the world. Why? So you can ask yourself, why am I in this situation? Who am I supposed to be? What can I do in this situation to make things a little more just? What can I do in this situation to bring comfort into this situation? Wow. All right, moving on. The next thing we see is a theodicy of protest. And this is exactly what we're talking about, this kind of chutzpah, this kind of divine audacity to question God. By the way, chutzpah, we usually spell it with a CH to start with, but when you're looking at Hebrew words that start with a CH, it usually means that they're pronounced with an aspirated H at the beginning, kind of a sound. So chutzpah. Anyway, theodicy of protest. when there's no explanation for anything. There's no way to understand why any righteous God would do anything at all. But I'm not going to quit believing in him. I'm not going to quit, talking to him. But my whole life becomes a big complaint because this should not be. God's okay with that. You're still believing on some level that there's an answer. You're still believing on some level, that things could be worked out. Why aren't they? And your whole life becomes a protest, if you will. And the greatest example of this in modern times is, of course, the Shoah, the Holocaust. And in this area, the author here, Livingston, talks about a guy that's one of my heroes, Elie Wiesel, who went into the concentration camps at a very young age. His whole family died in there. Actually, I think his father died when they were finally liberated or whatever on the way out in the midst of the winter. But he lived to be a very, very old man. And he has looked at this in ways that are disturbing to some people. But one of the most influential books he wrote is just called Night. So look it up. But he's basically just presenting the reality of the situation. He's not making any conclusions. He's just showing you how deeply, deeply effed up the situation is, how unjust it is, how, these situations have caused effects that in no way can you explain as being the will of God. There's no way that you can see how it caused anything good to happen. And you just tell the story. That's all you can do, is just tell the story and let people wrestle with it however they wrestle with it. But I'm making no attempt to explain this at all. My whole life protests against this kind of injustice. But on some level, you still believe in God. You still, you come before God's throne and say, still, I'm not okay with this. I protest against this. And again, in Christianity, this would not be seen as being okay. But in Judaism, it is much more okay, because Judaism holds the idea that if, for ethical reasons, for purposes of compassion or pursuing justice, you come before God and complain, that's actually a virtue. That's actually something that God honors. Moving on, we're going to get into something interesting here, and this is a guy named John Hick, no S on the end of his name, and we're talking about the free will defense. Now, remember how we talked about suffering as a condition of soul making? This is part of that, but it goes much, much farther. And this is I'll tell you why this is really important. Because atheists today, or agnostics for that matter, one of the major arguments that they would give against believing in a just God who's controlling everything is, if God really is sovereign and he really is just, why is the world the way it is? I mean, this is the essential problem of theodicy and monotheism, as we talked about. And so what Hick does, and I want you to read this and think about this, but I'm going to give you a brief synopsis and conclusion here. What Hick says is, okay, you're looking at everything in the world that is unjust. Let's think about the world as you think it ought to be. Okay? Everything you think that is unjust, let's imagine a world where none of those things existed, where everything was fair. Nobody hurt each other. Nobody committed a crime. Nobody experienced any lack. Nobody was in any kind of a problem or crisis situation where they had to decide how to respond to it or what it meant. None of this existed. Everything was perfect. Well, here's the problem with that. You couldn't make any ethical decisions of any kind. What's an ethical decision? An ethical decision is when I'm in a situation and I have a choice of choosing to act in a way that is going to bless other people, maybe at some cost to myself, or I can choose to look out for number one, for instance, and, oh, well, sorry about that, Sadie, I can't help you. It's going to cost me too much. We would say that is unethical, right? So in this perfect world, I wouldn't have any choices to make. None of the kind of choices that determine what a good person or a bad person is. I would never be faced with the choice of having to help somebody, because nobody would need any help. I'd never have to comfort anybody, because nothing would ever go wrong. Nobody'd ever be sad. I would never have to decide to do the right thing, because there would be no wrong things. And if there's no wrong things in the world, then it means that people don't even have the ability to do wrong things. So everything that we do, every decision that we make as people that we would consider an ethical decision, in other words, that either makes us a good person or a bad person, none of those kinds of decisions would exist. There would be no situation where we had to make the good choice, because if everything is good, then there's nothing bad. If everything's righteous, there's no such thing as unrighteousness. So, in a sense, we wouldn't even really be fully human. We wouldn't be able to respond in the best way. Nobody would have any need for anything. So, in a sense, the only reason that we know what justice is because we live in a world that's unjust. But here's what's interesting. The only reason that we know what injustice is because we also must have some idea of what justice is. We would not have either of those ideas in this perfect world. And that's what John Hick, it's called here a negative theodicy, and the word seems a little counterintuitive, or excuse me, the term, it's two words. I might have not chosen that, but in other words, it's a negative theodicy. In other words, imagine a world where you didn't need theodicy. You didn't need to in any way explain why there was injustice, because the world was so perfect. Then the ethical and moral values and qualities could not be formed. I couldn't be a good person. There'd be no difference between a good person and a bad person. We wouldn't even understand the concepts of good or bad, right or wrong, kind or cruel. None of those things would exist in a world that we're saying is perfect. So apparently it wouldn't be a very good world after all, because everything that you admire in people has to do with the way they respond to situations that are less than perfect. It has to do with who they decide to be and how they decide to be in situations where they can choose to be good or they can choose to be bad. And we like those people that make the good choices to be the best kind of people. But that couldn't happen in a perfect world. Now, one more thing, and this isn't in the book, but just to kind of add another perspective. In terms of this idea of injustice, I said we could not know what injustice is unless we had some idea of perfect justice. And where do we get that? We mentioned this in the beginning of the semester here. Where do we get that idea? Now, I don't want to debate that because obviously we could talk about that for a long time. But the point is we have it. Everybody has some idea of perfect justice. Everybody seems to know when they're being taken advantage of. People go, wait, that's not fair. And they come up with that all by themselves. They have some idea of what is fair, of what is just. Where do we get that? Well, I'm not going to answer that because it's a lot of debate on that question. But there is a writer who had a interesting experience in his own life. His name is C.S. Lewis. And you might know him as the one who wrote the Chronicles of Narnia. He's a Christian writer, very imaginative, but this is long before he was a Christian, okay? He was a philosophical atheist. He did not believe that God existed. And if you asked him why, he would give you a lot of the same answers that you hear from other people today. It's like, why are their children starving here? Why are horrible things happening to these people? Why is this and why is this? And pointing out all the injustice in the world as proof of the fact that a just God couldn't exist. Sounds good, right? Well, C.S. Lewis has the notable distinction, at least in my opinion, of being the closest example of somebody who accidentally converts himself just by thinking too much. So when he's thinking about all these things that are unjust, all of a sudden it dawns on him, wait a minute, by what standard am I judging? When I look at this and I say that it's unjust, I know it's unjust because I have a standard of what perfect justice is. But where did I get it? Perfect justice has never existed. And yet I know what it is. So it must exist somewhere. And he basically talked himself out of his atheism. He said if there was no ultimate justice, if there was no higher reality that was just, then I wouldn't even know what justice is. I wouldn't recognize the injustice in the world. The very fact that I recognize the injustice in the world means that justice must exist. And that's how he basically talked himself out of being an atheist. And he ended up being a pretty influential Christian, whether you like him or don't like him still. It's an interesting story in terms of how he, all by himself, converted himself from philosophical atheism to believing in God. Wow. All right, just a couple other things. Process theodicy. Now, way back in the beginning of the semester, when we were talking about theisms, okay, we talked about process theodicy. We just talked about it using a different term. We called it panentheism. Panentheism. Process theodicy, we said when we were talking about it in terms of panentheism, violates 3 of the higher attributes of God to make a nicer God. And the 3 attributes, the higher attributes of God that are violated by panentheism, that are rejected by panentheism or process theodicy, is the idea of God's omnipotence, God's omniscience, and God's unchangeable nature. So omniscience means he knows everything. Omnipotence or sovereignty means he's all powerful, he's in control of everything. And unchangeableness or immutability means that nothing affects God. Nothing makes God different than what he is. He doesn't learn anything new. He doesn't forget anything. He doesn't become better. He doesn't become worse. He doesn't change in terms of what he is. No other force in any way changes him. So process theodicy has created a nicer God by dismissing these ideas. Process theodicy, if you remember talking about panentheism, the whole world exists in God because God's everything. And God's chosen for it to exist, but God's put certain natural laws in place, and one of them is human beings. I mean, we can change the world that God has created that's a part of God. He's given us the power to do that. And by the way, today we're closer to being able to really do that in a major way than ever before. We're destroying our climate, and heck, a nuclear war, we might be able to, blow the planet up. But the point is, God doesn't really know what we're going to do. He's learning about us, and as we are making changes. And so certainly, as we're making changes he doesn't know about, he's certainly not in control. He's left himself out of control of these processes, if that makes some sense here. And finally, because the universe is a part of God, when we change the universe, we're changing God. But this is a nice God. I mean, he wants to know us. He wants to be part of our lives. And so he's created a world in which we have a lot of power to shape the world. And so this makes it really, really easy because God is no longer sovereign. And, whatever problems in the world, they're the result of us making bad decisions that change the world. And we talked about this again before in the theisms category. We called it panentheism. But process theodicy is basically the same thing here. Okay? And I think that's the last thing that we need to talk about in this chapter. And you will have a quiz, of course, on the things that we talked about. Thank you so much for tuning in.